Great, and we're broadcasting live on Facebook, and I'm admitting just a couple of other people. There we go. Great, and welcome Hannah Reynolds and Lisa. Yeah, welcome everybody. And welcome to our live on Facebook. I'm going to help mute everybody except for me. So that I can give an introduction to what we're talking about here, what our forum topic is, and who our panelists are, who I'm really excited to have, just really experts in the field. So when we talk about restorative justice, our idea of restorative justice, first of all, I'm Ben Pogue. I'm an attorney here in Charleston. I'm also a candidate for solicitor. I'm the Democratic nominee for solicitor of the 9th Judicial Circuit, which is all of Berkeley County and all of Charleston County. When we talk about restorative justice, the main things that we focus on are healing the harm to victims, to families, to entire neighborhoods and communities that is due to violence and criminal activity. But the bigger part of restorative justice is opening justice up to the community more, and integrating the community in how we view justice and the solutions that we come up with, whether they're diversion programs, whether they are accountability projects, or whether we have justice programs or policy or initiatives that are connected to initiatives within our community, which is also a priority for our campaign. But part of that community involvement is having robust discussions, honest discussions, even when they're a little bit uncomfortable. And it can certainly be uncomfortable when we're talking about race and justice, which is our topic for tonight. If you've come to us on Facebook or on Twitter, or if you've seen it on our website, you'll notice that this is part one of our series. It's because race and justice is a humongous topic that is filled with nuances and complexity, and it's filled with emotions as well. And it's filled with so many different facets, we can't possibly address all of those things in 1 hour long period of time. If you joined us last week, you'll know that the format for our discussions is to have a brief introduction, which I'm doing now, followed by a panelist discussion. So we'll have our panelists talking, and then we'll break out into breakout rooms on our Zoom call. And if you'd like to be a participant on the Zoom call in the future, feel free to email us at info@votebenpogue.com, and we'll try and bring you into the conversation that way. During our breakout sessions, one of our participants, who's actually going to be a panelist for our next forum in 2 weeks, will discuss with me some of the things that we'll be talking about in that, and that's Grant Gilmore, Dr. Grant Gilmore of the College of Charleston, when we'll be talking about race and justice again, but really beyond criminal justice, the other ways that we have justice in our justice system, but also justice in our society, in our communities. So we'll have those breakout sessions, then we'll reconvene and get some feedback from the different breakout rooms, and hopefully be done right at 8 o'clock. So once again, thank you for joining us. Just to introduce our panelists this evening. First is DJ Polite, and DJ, I'm going to unmute you here. There you go. If you could unmute yourself, then we can make sure that we can hear you. Don DJ Polite is a doctoral candidate at the University of South Carolina. He's originally from Brooklyn, New York, graduated from Williams College for his undergrad, then he got his master's in history from Brooklyn College, and is now working on his doctorate over at the University of South Carolina, studying history, and specifically a lot of his work centers on race and empire, and he'll tell us a little bit more about that and add a historical perspective to this discussion of race and justice. And our other panelists, and Dr. Brown, I'm going to unmute you as well, and you can unmute yourself so that everybody can hear you. I'm especially delighted to have Dr. Robert Brown, who I refer to as Dr. Brown all the time, but we also know each other as Ben and Bobby, because back in the day, we were classmates in the class of 1987, which dates us, Bobby, which dates us back at good old Mount Vernon High School. So we go back some 35 or so years. It's a long time. So we always want to be transparent. So Dr. Brown and I have a history of friendship between us, but just a little bit more about Dr. Brown. He's well known in the criminal justice field around the country. And he is the chair of the Criminal Justice Department at North Carolina Central University. He has also been, he serves as a program evaluator for Cumberland County in North Carolina, the Veterans Treatment Court up there. And as an evaluator for the Fayetteville, North Carolina Police Department's Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program. He's worked as a sentencing mitigation specialist for the National Center on Institutions and Alternatives, coordinating offender-specific rehabilitation and supervision programs for offenders at state and federal levels. And he's been a panelist on numerous discussions, national discussions regarding race and justice, just like he is tonight. So Dr. Brown, I really appreciate you being here, and I appreciate seeing you, seeing you not really in person, but sort of in person again. So with all that said, I want to dive into it. First, briefly, DJ and Dr. Brown, is there anything that I missed out on your bios or specific things that you're studying or working on right now that are relevant to our discussion this evening?
I wouldn't say anything, but I will say I'm originally from the Bronx. I studied in Brooklyn. I'm originally from the Bronx. It's important.
That's important.
Two stops on the 4 train line away from Yankee Stadium, and that's very important.
Oh, you had to bring the Yankees into it. I just
Always.
You're going to get that. Oh my gosh. And Dr. Brown, anything you wanted to add that you're working on these days?
No, I think you hit the major highlights.
Okay.
If folks were to Google me, many things would come up indicating I'm a policing scholar. I focus on research related to how officers interact with citizens and how demographic characteristics of officers and citizens, extra legal characteristics like gender, race, ethnicity, age, what effects they have on the outcomes of police-citizen encounters. But I've traveled a long road. I have a history in working in the field of corrections, court-based research and processing, and policing.
Fantastic. And thanks again for joining us. So one of the things that I want to mention, although I'm the facilitator and sort of moderator tonight, as we've discussed all throughout our campaign, I'm also a white male, and I've grown up with white privilege, often with such an environment where there are areas of privilege and racial bias that are so interwoven with the experience of a lot of people who look like me, that I've got my own blind spots and my own racial biases. And that's something that we want to have as sort of a baseline understanding, that we don't all understand each other's experiences. And a lot of folks who look like me have less understanding because some of those disparities and inequities have been veiled to some extent. But we want to understand what those racial biases are as best we can. That's part of the reason that we have forums like this one. So Dr. Brown, I'll start off with you. And I wanted to start off with just a look at the process itself. When we talk about justice and what a lot of people think of as criminal justice, there are so many parts to this. There's the initial arrest and maybe life before the arrest. And then there is the arrest, there's processing, there's the justice process, there's sentencing. If you had to take an overall look at the ways in which race and perception intersect with that justice process, what are the things that stick out to you?
Okay. First of all, thank you, Ben. Thank you for having me, and it's great to see you, and it's great to be here with everyone. Please, I don't mind at all if you call me Bobby, and we'll save Bobby Brown jokes for the time we have on this forum. We can tackle those in another panel, but please just remember we're all here to talk and learn with each other. So don't ever worry about it being a Dr. Brown thing. With that said, I am going to share with you some things that I would share if we were at the start of an introduction to criminal justice class. And some of the things that stand out to me in trying to answer the question that you posed, Ben, is we need to recognize the myth of a criminal justice system, because this is really problematic for us. In America, we have a criminal justice process that looks similar from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And by jurisdiction, I'm talking at the city, county, state level. But we have systems within systems that follow a criminal justice process that leads many people to think that there's some uniform way that law and justice works in our country, and it doesn't. And why it is important to understand this, something that happens in Chicago may be very different than something that happens in Charleston and something that happens in Charlotte, North Carolina. But because people operate under the premise that we have a criminal justice system that is very structured and very connected, and instead of realizing it's a loosely coupled system at best, people think that that thing that happened in Chicago is exactly like what's happening in Charleston and what's happening in Charlotte. And that becomes problematic in today's age, where people see things happen, the justice process works out a certain way, someone's charged with a crime or someone's not charged or someone is acquitted, and people say the system is broken, and they're operating under the premise that there was this unified system in the first place that was somehow working. So before we get into talking about how things like race, ethnicity, and class matter, we need to share information and make sure that we're on a similar page, and that criminal justice is nowhere near as uniform as people think it is in our society.
So, Bobby, it sounds like, so there's not as much uniformity as we think, but then on top of that lack of uniformity from place to place, state to state, city to city, municipality, we've got individuals who have highly discretionary interactions with the public and with each other that adds another layer, it seems, of non-uniformity. Where does race play a part in each of those interactions?
So, and I would not be surprised at all if I'm stepping on DJ's toes and talking points. Understanding that criminal justice is always a reflection of a society's government. If a person recognizes the decentralized nature of American government and society, a person will better understand how criminal justice, which is a function of government, how criminal justice is working. Well, when you go through American history and you understand how we've developed and evolved and how race has mattered contextually over time and in different places, some places ranging from, I think what you were talking about, you can have individuals who engage in acts of racial discrimination and bias, to you can have structural racism, you can have jurisdictions where race has mattered and race has mattered significantly in how government worked and how criminal justice worked and how social issues work in a particular area. I'm in North Carolina, you are in South Carolina, the history of race and the South, and again, I'm betting the DJ will talk about some things from slavery to black codes to Jim Crow, to even without those things being codified, written, do we still have racial issues that play out in the way the justice process work and the way people who work in the justice process, how they do things? So criminal justice and race are very contextualized.
So let me switch on over to DJ. You mentioned the historical perspective. DJ, it seems to me we've got this history of race in America and racial disparity. That's part of our history for the last 400 years. How does that still manifest itself in terms of racial bias that we each have as individuals? And how does it manifest itself in terms of some of these interactions that are stressful, interactions that regard law and criminality? And what's the historical perspective on that?
So when we think about the history of criminal justice, policing, stuff of that nature, it's important to note that, just like Dr. Bobby, I'm going to give you a title anyway, mentioned that it is very much a geographic thing. I know there's, of course, that history of slavery and the fact that in the US South, there's this growth of slave patrols, and that is absolutely true. But we also need to understand that in different regions, that's also going to develop in different ways. For instance, in the urban north, there's going to be policing that's developing not necessarily to control slaves or enslaved peoples, but going to be able to or try to control migrants coming from Europe and them being seen as not belonging. Or in the West, East Asian migrants, Japanese, Chinese coming in and policing and criminal justice being forced on them or on the borderlands. Again, a lot of this is a history of who does the US society believe belongs and who doesn't. When we think about criminal justice, it is a question of, again, this like power structure. And I think I've said it a couple of times, that it's a question of power and rights. Who has power and who has an ability to access rights and actually appeal to rights? And that is not always the same. There's like a constant historical push and pull there on who can access rights and when, and how is that rubbing up against a power structure in a given locality. And that is going to be shaped, of course, contextually by place, by place, by place. And of course, this larger process, these larger systems, what the case may be, of exclusion and inclusion, who can be excluded, who can be included in a given place, that is going to be repeated similarly over and over again, but have this kind of local, regional flair, if you will.
So when you talk about that regional flair, it sounds like you're sort of saying that this history of racial bias that we end up with, it ends up manifesting itself in how we view the world around us practically right in the present, even though we've got this baggage of 400 years. Am I surmising that right?
Absolutely. I mean, when we think about public rhetoric, there's always a question of, and it's sometimes explicit, but sometimes very implicit, on who belongs in a certain place at a certain time. Sometimes it is in the form of, again, immigration, and then that becomes race. It's like, oh, I don't like illegal immigrants. And that seems to be like a term, and everyone knows what that means. But in practice, what that means is you're going to focus your attention and your law enforcement and your judicial systems on people who look a certain way. At the borderlands, of course, it's going to be people who look, in this case, migrants. They look Mexican, they look Latino. And they say, well, I'm going to pass laws or engage in practices, perhaps, that says I'm going to look out for people who look a certain way. And it's not because that, and they're going to tell themselves, it's not because I have a thing against anti-Latino bias. It just so happens that all these migrants who are illegal happen to be this way. And so that justifies my action to police them further.
Okay,
and so that happens.
Like, it sounds like it's this cycle where we've got maybe a power dynamic issue, a historic power dynamic issue, then that is reflected in policy where we're using policy proxies for racial bias, and then that feeds into practice and how people are treated by the system. And it seems to me that would lead to us having these self-fulfilling prophecies or self-satisfying conclusions when we're looking at what our policies have told us, what this data really comes up with as far as conclusions, even if the data has a whole lot of inherent racial bias in it.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most seminal works I think about is The Condemnation of Blackness by Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, where he looks at the 1800s, early 1900s, as, again, we see this larger uptick in migration from the US South to the US North, and this consolidation of cities. And they say, well, we're seeing that, this crime happening in these cities. And so we're going to apply data science because that's, unbiased. We're just going to use data. That's the mark of a civilized and modern society, to look at data. And then if you focus all your data on a place of crime, and then you say, oh, well, the data saying that people in this environment who just so happen to be African-American in this environment are criminals. Well, I mean, you went in searching for data on a place that happens to have a lot of crime. And that happens over and over again, where you go into a situation going to say, I'm going to simply apply the data. Going in with your misplaced assumptions, your preconceived biases, and then the data comes back with your just affirming those preconceived assumptions. And then you can use that to justify those actions. Like, oh, well, it just so happens that in this locale, these people who live here are predisposed to this kind of activity, this criminal activity, and thus we need to pump more resources into stopping that activity. And we keep on finding that activity over and over again without looking at the next door, how other people in surrounding areas who don't fit your profile are also engaging in the activity, but you're putting a magnifying glass to solve a problem and finding that problem underneath a magnifying glass. Who knew that looking at things under a magnifying glass that you will see things?
Yeah, that's amazing. So we're biased in our focus. We're biased in how that focus affects our conclusions. And Dr. Brown, Bobby, sorry, you've actually done a ton of research and really fascinating research in this area. I'd love it if you could talk to us a little bit about your experiences riding with cops in your doctoral work in Cincinnati. And specifically, you and I talked about this a couple of days ago, about the interesting case where you were on a ride along and there was a guy trying to catch a bus, and how the perceptions that we have that are historic work into those kinds of things. Indeed.
First, I want to note everything. I agree with everything that you said, DJ. We ignore the historical context of so many things and how it imprints upon us, how it structures our thoughts. In conversations about bias, we don't even fully understand why some of the biases that we have, the roots of them. We don't understand that, oh, we've accepted a certain narrative that's how we've gotten to this point in history, that's how things have evolved. And when we subscribe to narratives that are incomplete and maybe even just erroneous, someone may be biased, and it's a bias that they don't understand because they lack the information about what has really transpired. That does play into a story that I shared with Ben about some experiences that I had as a doctoral student and in the process of becoming Dr. Brown. I went to the University of Cincinnati for my PhD, and I had the good fortune of working on the only year-long systematic social observation of the police in our country. Dating back to the 1960s, policing scholars have engaged in a practice of systematically observing the police, riding along with the police, people who are trained observers, writing down everything that happens during the shift with the officer, their interactions, tracking down to the detail of who said what order that things were said, whether a person was disrespectful to a police officer, whether an officer was disrespectful to someone, because the policing literature, it's been pretty consistent finding that when officers feel that they are disrespected, they tend to be more coercive with individuals. So tracking all of that so that it could be coded into a statistical database and analyzed to see what actually after statistical analysis influenced the outcome, what influenced whether someone got a ticket or not, or a report was written or not, or a person was arrested or not, whether force was used or not. So I've been trained on how to do that research and collecting that data. And I had an experience during my time in Cincinnati. I was the only Black American male on this year-long project collecting the data. And we all went through training on how to measure things, how to gauge disrespect and the temporal order of disrespect. And there was a situation where there was a young man that a police officer ended up arresting because he was standing in the middle of a city block, downtown Cincinnati. And when the officer came along, the officer told him to move. He alleged that he was up to no good, probably selling drugs or something. And the young man, early 20s, told the officer to leave him alone, stop harassing me, go catch somebody really engaging in crime. I'm just trying to catch the bus. The officer said, if you're trying to catch the bus, go to the corner where the bus stop is. And there was a bus stop at that corner, and it had one of the little shelters and everything. And the young man said, leave me alone. I'm just trying to catch the bus. I'm going to work. The officer got out of the car, asked him some more questions, told him to move. The young man didn't. The officer put him in the car and took him downtown, made an arrest to make a point. What the officer would not believe was, number one, that he was trying to catch a bus. And what my role as an observer was to get information from the officer on his decision making, not trying to influence his decision. When I debriefed him and I asked him, why did you make him move? He said, well, he was lying to me. He was being disrespectful, and he was lying to me. If he were really trying to catch the bus, he would have walked to the corner where the bus stop was. When I got back to the research team, and I was getting the feedback from the professor, the doctor who was running the project, and I explained the sequence of events, everybody on the team said that the young black man was disrespectful first, and he was disrespectful first. And I pushed back. I said, well, he wasn't disrespectful. He was trying to catch the bus, and he was playing the bus lines. And if you've ever caught a city bus, if you've ever had to use public transportation, you would know that he was trying to get to a certain point, and it was more of a matter of him getting whichever bus came first that was going to take him to the main terminal so that he could connect to where his final destination was. But if you've never had the lived experience of trying to catch a bus, and no one on the project grew up in an urban environment, no one on the project caught a bus, had to rely on public transportation. I have had that experience. It shaped the way the research happened. When I talked to that officer, I did another ride along with that officer later, and when we debriefed, I asked him about that incident and his thoughts. He had never considered maybe the guy was telling me the truth and he was just playing the bus line. He was focused on, you're lying to me because you're not doing what I'm telling you to do right now. When I shared this story with Ben and why he asked it, we agreed to make sure that it was shared in this forum tonight, because one of the challenges that we have is that in understanding justice and understanding race and class and related things, too often we are unfamiliar with the lived experiences of people who are the other. And even when we hear them, we don't want to accept them and believe them. In this forum, I saw a couple of faces as when certain things in the story unfolded, you were, yeah, that makes complete sense. And it would to somebody who can understand that lived experience. But to some other people in that moment in time, he was just a disrespectful young black man who was up to no good. And had he just followed the officer's orders, he wouldn't have been arrested.
Yeah, we see that, Bobby, we see that difference in experience, as you mentioned, the lack of lived experience. And that triggers in my mind something that DJ, you and I have talked about in the past when it comes to our history of really segregation, de jure segregation, something that's brought up in The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And the separation of individuals that has the real life consequences that Dr. Brown was talking about, that's also that's an intentional thing. That may not be something that people today have done intentionally, because we weren't making the policies 100 years ago, 150 years ago. But that history of segregation does have real life consequences now, and it was intentional back then. Is that something that we really need to recognize?
No, absolutely. I mean, it is something that we need to recognize. I think about, what does it mean to transition from enslavement to Reconstruction, emancipation, right? It's a displacement, yes, of a system, but also a displacement on how people view their world. Enslavement and the system that enforced it creates a hierarchy. These people are better and these people are worse. That's clear cut. But when you get rid of that overnight, people need to replace that to rebuild their world in a way that reinforces that some people are better and some people are worse, or they don't want to say it that way. It's like some people are more worthy of certain kind of oppression, if you will. Some people deserve exploitation. Some people deserve extra punishment. Some people deserve to have to work the kinds of jobs that I don't want to work. And if that doesn't happen with enslavement, then how do you replace that? So, I mean, immediately you get, after enslavement, vagrancy laws. It's like, you know what? I'm not, I'm not someone who believes in slavery anymore. All of a sudden, everything overnight, everybody who had slaves is like, actually, slavery was always bad. I hated it. But what is really the issue is, and you'll get two kinds of racism that come out. There are people who believe that racism is permanent, and actually by biological fact, you are inferior, and others who say, well, no, I agree that enslavement destroyed something and held you back. But someday, African Americans will improve their station in life, catch up, and then things will be fine. But both of those are racist beliefs, in the sense that when you say it's like, oh, one day African Americans will catch up, and then they leave that second part of when, why, how, up to grabs. And then when you put in laws, it's like, well, I'm not racist. I'm just saying that this person is engaging in behavior that is not useful, not productive. This is actually a remnant of them barking back at a change in their reality. And so we need to reimpose order for them. And then this system of perhaps enslavement, forced work, coerced labor will teach them the value of work that they clearly do not have. And that happens over and over again. It's like outside of that system, it's like, again, you'll see in different kinds of scenarios. I think one of the other scenarios I thought about, there's another book, Talk With You Like a Woman by Cheryl Hicks, where she looks at African-American women who come up from, again, the US South to the urban North, early 1900s, and they're engaging in what are seen as sexually deviant behaviors, right? They're staying out too late, they're a little bit too brash, whatever the case may be. And people are saying, well, we need to reform them somehow. So we're gonna send them to a reformatory. Now you, as an African-American woman, can choose to either stay at this reformatory or we can send you back to where you belong, which is the US South, because clearly that environment is better for you. And it's, again, imposing values on a certain people that you believe because of their behavior. Now, it's not because of race, but because of their behavior, deserve to be controlled more. Now, of course, that has nothing to do with race.
But isn't it sort of using behavior or our sensitivity to behaviors as a proxy for racial bias?
Absolutely. It absolutely is a question of using behavior as a proxy, because in that her work, she looked at how white women of the time engaged in the same behavior. They're not given this choice of like either stay in reformatory or get sent back to where you belong. It's okay, you actually need more help.
Okay, that's used as a
Good.
point. Yeah, go ahead, Bobby.
DJ, you touched on something earlier that I wanted to respond to, and I think you've reinforced it again. We need to keep in mind that we have a long history of the criminal justice system, and agents of the criminal justice system being used to preserve place. And DJ, when you talked about it, it's an extremely powerful point. We need to make sure that in these conversations about race, that we are recognizing context. Who is the other in the American South? And we tend to get caught up in a black-white dichotomy when discussing race. Well, how that played out in the Southwest and in the American West and in the Midwest and in Big Sky country, who is the other is still relevant. Because we have if you go and you look at certain regions, whoever is classified as the other, whoever is the minority group, and if you add race to what defines someone as a minority, you're going to see a lot of evidence of those individuals getting the worst end, the worst outcomes when it comes to how the criminal justice system works. And that's in part because we have used the police and we have used our courts and we have used our jails and prisons to preserve place, and we have used them to preserve order, whatever order means.
Yes.
And I want to tie that back to my first point of related to the myth of a criminal justice system. We mistakenly believe that laws fix all things without recognition of, okay, well, notice we have to make laws to deal with the things that are going on, and that's an evolving process. To we don't have the best track record of always following the rules. Just because oftentimes in a classroom or in some public forums, people will start off with a question, blah, 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 blah. And can the police do this? Or can the courts do this? And I go, yes, they can. But this thing is against the law. And I have to explain to people, in that moment in time, in an encounter on the streets with a police officer, they have or else power, and they can do something that's clearly against the Constitution, state laws, agency policy in that moment in time. The remedy, we have post ex facto remedies. We tend to fix bad things that happen in the legal process and the justice process after it's happened. So even though we have rules that should guide the behavior of police officers and guide the behavior of prosecutors, we do not have nearly as strong a mechanisms as people think when it comes to stopping that bad behavior from happening when it happens. We have mechanisms where we can potentially go back and fix a wrong. Someone can be fired, someone can be charged with a crime, someone can be civilly sued and held accountable, but it does not necessarily change the fact that something really bad happened, like someone's civil rights were violated, or someone was physically harmed. So we have to reconcile the myth that the law is so powerful. Laws in and of themselves and statutes are so powerful, and that's going to and then that trickles down to, and training is so powerful. If we train people on laws and policies, they will always do the right thing. It doesn't work out that way. And those margins where sometimes there's not a law or a policy saying you can't do this, and that leaves frontline criminal justice workers like police officers free to do things that it's not against law and it's not against policy. So you can't tell me I'm wrong. You can't tell me I'm misusing my power, because I have great power. I have a lot of discretion in what I do. And that power and discretion is often used to preserve order and place, whatever order and place means in that location. And that's why you can have someone getting stopped, someone being questioned, someone being arrested in that moment in time, and we have to possibly fix it later.
And you talk about the fixes. The fixes, we know that there is an error rate in our fixes. We know that in large part, due to just human nature, but also in part due to racial bias, that there are errors. There's an error rate. And the worst case scenario is a wrongful conviction for those kinds of things. So it sounds like if we're not really aware on a continuing basis of our biases and the ways we have misperceptions, the reason we don't have misperception, the reasons we have misperceptions, then we end up with these fixes that we believe in, but that really can be very harmful to individuals and can be harmful in deteriorating everyone's trust in the justice system. Just not head. All right, I'll take that as a yes. I want to get to a couple more things before we break out. Let me just go through one question I want you guys to answer briefly before we go into a breakout session. I want to see if we can get to our breakout sessions by 7:45, because we've got some important questions there. So we talk about, we're actually in a race where I'm the first person who has opposed the incumbent, where there's been a general election for solicitor in 20 years in Charleston and Berkeley County. And we've talked about the ways in which politics affect the disparities. So to both of you, and feel free to jump in, whoever wants to first, how do unopposed races for district attorneys, solicitors, state prosecutors. How does the fact that people are unopposed affect the disparities that we've had, and how do they affect how well the justice system is functioning?
DJ, do you want that one first, or do you want me to go?
You go ahead first.
Sure. So again, it all depends on the district attorney or the solicitor. We have mechanisms to bring about change in criminal justice that we often do not use. And one of those primary mechanisms is the vote, the election cycle. Prosecutors historically operate in a big black box. A lot of people do not know what prosecutors or solicitors actually do. We have very limited real world views into what goes on in district attorney's offices, prosecutor offices, solicitor offices, and how they're conducting their business. The conviction rate, which is something that is oftentimes used as a measure, as a proxy for the performance of prosecutors. But if you were to ask the public, or if you were to do a media search in a particular county, how often is the conviction rate of a district attorney's office ever put up? Is it put up annually like the crime rate? Do you get to summertime and you say, the conviction rate, we've got a trend line of the correct conviction rate, or let's look over the years at the conviction rate? Even if that was a good measure of a prosecutor's office, think about it honestly. How often do you even see it? How often do you know about it?
What does it even mean?
So when it comes to,
you can cherry pick your cases, what does that even mean?
Exactly. And if people were to become more educated and the information stuck with folks, that most cases are resolved through plea bargaining. Plea bargaining is normal. It's not actually much of a bargain. It's not a break. It happens upwards of 90% of the time. So it's actually the going rate. It's the norm of what's happening in most jurisdictions. Trial conviction rates. Okay, sure. If we somehow track those things, the bottom line, what makes someone a good prosecutor at a community level is a bit ambiguous for folks.
And we don't even know where that data comes from. So maybe managing the information, you have the same person that's a candidate who's unopposed, who's also the gatekeeper. And DJ, it seems like that's historically one of the issues, is when you've got a person who's an elected official who isn't opposed, and they also act as the gatekeeper as to what information the public gets.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple things I'm thinking about. So when you have a lot of these, and I'll get to this idea of the gatekeeper of information in a second, but before that, it's just this question of, when you have these unchallenged seats, you can obscure the fact of what powers they have and what they can change. It's like when you have an uncontested seat, then you just know that there apparently is a prosecutor somewhere, and you just assume, well, they have to prosecute crimes, as simple as it goes. And you don't believe that actually they have discretionary power to prosecute or not prosecute, and what things they want to emphasize or not. You forget that they actually are decision makers as well as people who are just in the process of applying law.
And there's no oversight.
There is no oversight. And so people just kind of just lose track of that until you can get a challenge seat and a different prosecutor says, like, I can do this differently. And then someone goes, wait a second, prosecutors can do things differently? There's choices that can be made, the decisions that can be made that are different depending on who I put in there. That's wild. I couldn't even imagine that. But secondly, yes, when you have these solicitors come in and they're, again, the gatekeepers of information, then they can fall back on, well, you should reelect me because of the conviction rate. And someone goes, I mean, I guess that's a good conviction rate. I don't know how to fact check you on that. I don't know what a good conviction rate is or what it isn't. I don't know what goes into that data. again, the question of plea bargain, stuff of that nature.
Yeah.
But then,
That might be a good reason for us to have constant accountability, like with a racial bias audit or with a community-based independent organization, right?
yeah, and the last thing I would say is when they focus on things like a conviction rate, then you are not focusing on other things that could potentially be more useful to a community.
Yeah.
Oh, I have a high conviction rate. Cool. Has the crime in my community gone up or down? Or more importantly, has the conditions in which I live improved or not improved? Because if you are just putting people away over and over and over again, but then leaving a couple of broken families behind, they're reducing the actual socioeconomic conditions of families, then actually a high conviction rate is harmful. It's not just not important, it's harmful.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into our breakout room. So 2 questions, and really you touched on this. The first question is overall, how do we identify our own blind spots? And Dr. Brown, you talked about this. We've got blind spots, especially people like who look like me. I have racial bias. I have blind spots of my own. How do we do that in a way that is productive and that doesn't distance us from one another? But also, DJ, going back to some of the things that you said, our second question is, what comes first in moving us all forward? Policy changes, education, or socioeconomic changes? It's a chicken and egg problem, but which is the most effective first step? So with that, I'm going to open up our breakout rooms. I'm going to talk to Professor Grant Gilmore on the other side. So you have all now been invited to join your breakout rooms. If you'll go ahead and do that. And Professor Gilmore, Dr. Gilmore, I should go ahead and say that you and I will talk just a little bit. So if you could unmute, I'm going to unmute you. And if you could unmute yourself, then we'll be able to talk on the backside of this. So how are you? Thank you for joining us.
I'm well, thank you. Well, considering, and
Yeah,
Grant is fine.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Yeah. What we're going to be discussing in 2 weeks is beyond criminal justice. So we tend to think about the criminal justice system, but it's a lot of times just really the justice system. And sometimes when that can be intentional or unintentional. When people talk about the criminal justice system, it is a bit of a label, and it tends to be that criminal part tends to be applied to people even before or during their arrest, which we know as a constitutional right, you have the right to be innocent until proven guilty. But I think there was a recent article where somebody said, well, if there's arrest, for instance, when somebody runs from the police, they're guilty of something, but
because they ran.
Criminal justice doesn't do a whole lot toward getting us back to the constitutional rights that we've had. But justice is more than criminal justice. So there are other facets of justice, and you and I have talked about this. And a lot of times that social justice work has a whole lot of intersection, whether it's in transportation, education, housing, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about how all these facets of justice are related?
Yeah, absolutely. When you step out of your house, every decision you make within the context of the built environment, the social environment, or the economic environment, or even the religious environment that you're interacting with has been impacted by all of the other elements that I just mentioned, and has a direct relationship to the way society as a whole, historically and in the present, deploys resources for law enforcement. And since the beginning of the settlement of the Americas by European powers, Western laws have evolved and morphed in ways to maximally impact people's lives through religion, economics, social issues, in order to maximize the economic benefits for elites, those who could invest in the conquered land, the land removed from Native Americans, and to retain that power it's all about power, and whether it's power through gender, whether it's power through economic relationships, or maintaining the religious status quo, and ideally expanding the religious status quo. All of these things are reflected in our society today, here in the United States.
It seems like, one thread of what you're talking about seems to be this, whether it's intentional or not intentional, historically, a preservation of order.
Correct.
But it also seems like that preservation of order might be beneficial to some, but it also seems like that really holds us as an entire society back in a lot of ways, because if you preserve an order where certain
there are some people that are not going to advance.
Right, then they don't have an opportunity to
They don't
rise.
have a chance in hell.
Right.
To be perfectly frank.
Right, and then
Yeah.
they don't contribute to the overall economic wealth, political wealth, and personal wealth and success in life that
Or
really,
even well-being.
right, exactly, that can be the tide that raises all boats, right?
Correct.
And it's
Absolutely.
interesting, and I know you and I have talked about this when we talk about some of these facets: transportation, education, housing, healthcare. When our recap team, recap in North Charleston, rebuilding every community around peace, when we talk to folks on, in their neighborhood, in their environment, which is a really big part of understanding what's going on, we typically hear about those resource-starved areas. I don't have transportation to get here. And if they intersect with the criminal justice system, then I don't necessarily have, I really literally don't have a way to get from here to there on time and still do a job or still parent or care for a loved one. And a lot of times, if you're going through the criminal justice system, those socioeconomic issues where there's starvation of resources are not considered at all. So what are we doing, right?
Perhaps the penultimate goal in all of this is if the rest of society is running well and as it should be, no people should have to interact with the criminal justice system. And a solicitor should be able to sit on their hands all day. If there's economic and social and religious and political equality in a society, then in an ideal situation, there would be barely any criminality.
Yeah, I guess that would be the goal, right? The goal is to reduce crime as much as possible so that you give people an opportunity to succeed on their own. With that, we're closing the room, so people should be joining us momentarily.
I look forward to 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, and we'll be talking much more about this in our Restorative Justice Forum on July 29th, which again focuses on race and justice, but looks at a more expansive view of justice, which definitely helps the criminal justice system. We know we've got data and years of studies to support the fact that when we've got greater resources, whether they're economic or in terms of transportation, like I mentioned, some of those key areas: transportation, education, healthcare, housing stability, then you see reductions in crime. So why are we spending all of our time focusing on criminality when we could eliminate criminality in a lot of respects simply by focusing on some other things? There may be a more cost-efficient.
Crime is a symptom.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Grant, thanks for your time. We've only got a few minutes left. So Bobby and DJ, I want to focus on you guys and tell us as our panelists what you found out, what your groups talked about real quick, and we'll wrap this up in about 5 or 6 minutes.
I think in my group, we talked about some of the challenges in recognizing implicit bias. We had some commonality in our group of folks who either work or have connections to people who work in high schools and with young people. And we got to chat a little bit about how interacting with young people, particularly high schoolers, can be a place where you get exposed to a lot of differences, and there are a lot of opportunities to challenge oneself with okay, why do I see things this way? And how might I need to look at it differently from the perspective of the people that I'm looking at, not just my own experience. Is that a fair summation,
Yeah.
group? Breakout group?
We get
Yeah, and
things up.
we talked about how I went to the better school.
Indeed, indeed.
Well, it sort of seems like, Dr. Brown, you killed two birds with one stone. Sounds like from a policy or from a change standpoint, focus on education about racial bias early on and have that be the same conduit to be more aware of our own racial bias at the same time.
Let me just say this quickly. We won't have time to get into it. In policing and in the justice system, there's a strong push for implicit bias training. And in general, I support it. One of the things that we need to be very careful of is that a lot of the trainings and a lot of the initiatives come in, shake the tree, walk away and leave. Hey, we came in, we introduced you to this concept of implicit bias. I'm biased, you're biased, everybody's biased. We're not racist. And then the work does not oftentimes does not continue of what do you then do about your biases? And I encourage everyone in your own spaces, if you really want to move the needle, after you have a implicit bias discussion, make sure you have part 2 where you deal with, okay, we've recognized that bias is real. What can we do about that bias? Because just recognizing it
Not
is
enough.
not enough.
We'll certainly have more next week with a big announcement from our campaign, but I'm going to keep that under wraps for now. DJ, what did your group talk about?
I'll get to that once. I just want to respond to one thing that Bobby was mentioning just now about implicit bias and implicit bias training. Implicit bias training has its usefulness, of course, but the way to really learn about your biases and actually deconstruct them is not in a training. It's by actually getting to know as many different kinds of people as possible. You can't do that in a training. That's not a very contextual or very life-like way of interacting with somebody through a training exercise. It just erodes a lot of the contextual information. For instance, like that issue of the busing. It's like, oh, you can have as many implicit bias trainings as you want, but if you don't know public transit because you haven't had that actual lived experience, then there's not a training in the world that can provide you with that kind of contextual information. But a lot of what we talked about was that second question is like, what changes come first? Policy, information, or socioeconomic resources? And I said, it's kind of a cop-out that like they all have to come at the same time. But they can be if you are intentional about what you're doing. I think one of the things that I was telling them is like one of the pieces of research that I did early in my degree was the history of education reform, from like Ronald Reagan to pretty much Barack Obama. We're going to start charter schools so they can experiment, or whatever the case may be. We need to fix education. And actually the data shows that fixing education to try to close achievement gaps, racial inequalities in terms of education is not a very cost-effective or an at all effective way of fixing those things. One of the quickest ways to improve education outcomes is by changing the socioeconomic conditions in which people live. Oh, did you know that actually if you gave someone stable housing,
Right, stable
they can perform better in the classroom? Who knew? Who knew that if you actually address like food insecurities, that children can perform better in the classroom? Oh no. And you have to think about people as holistic, right? You can't police out bad behavior. And it happens in education, it happens in policing, it happens in crime. You can't just control people's behavior and get better outcomes.
Right.
But you always get better outcomes when you treat people and provide them with the resources to live a life of dignity and respect. And then who knows? Oh my goodness, I can't believe that this child that I thought was a miscreant, was a bad apple, whatever the case may be, I realized they didn't have stable housing. I realized they were hungry. I realized I didn't see them as a worthy of my attention and care, and that they were actually a competent and compassionate human being. But once I saw that, and they saw that I saw that, oh no, they can perform so much better. And that happens in society.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that insight. And I know we've got to go. It's 8 o'clock. I wanted to thank everybody and thank you for those insights. When we have these siloed solutions, we know that they don't necessarily work. We are definitely going to be talking about that. Please follow us on votebenpogue.com. Follow us on our Facebook page. I think our Facebook is Vote Ben Pogue 2020. And you can also follow us on Twitter. And I follow Dr. Brown and DJ Polite on Twitter, who are outstanding follows, lots of tremendous information. And we are going to be posting this later on Facebook, so you'll get to see the entire thing if you just came in a little bit late. Thank you all so much for being DJ and Bobby. Thank you. Bobby, I'll talk to you in another couple days at the very least as we continue to catch up. And DJ, thank you very much. Grant Gilmore, we look forward to having you as a panelist in 2 weeks. That's July 29th at 7 p.m. You can catch us on Facebook. And if you'd like to be a participant, again, email us at info@votebenpogue. Thanks everybody once again, and have a great night. Take care.
Thank you.